Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
President Trump addressed the nation yesterday, basically about immigration and making his case to the American people. So today we're going to look at, everybody uses the word fact check, but we're gonna highlight some of the important pieces of it and make sure that you have the information to decide what you ought to take away from the speech. Okay, how's that? That's what we're going to do today. And hopefully you care because, what comes out of the president's mouth, regardless of who the president is or what party you are affiliated with, matters to you because that individual is supposed to be leading the nation. Whether or not it's true, whether or not it's false, what direction they're planning to go, all of that very much so has and can have a big impact on your life. For some more than others. But today we're going to take this opportunity to break it down for you and make sure that you've got the most important facts. But of course, we couldn't begin this conversation without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
We're going to break it down. I like that. That's a good phrase. We're going to break it down.
We'll start here. We're not going to read the whole thing, obviously, because...
Hey, it only took 9 minutes for the president to read it.
That's right.
So you could probably read it in 7.
Yeah. But we're going to need the time for some other stuff. So
okay.
I'm just going to highlight a few things here and we'll highlight different parts throughout. But,
I listened to it.
Yeah, you
I was there
You
in my living room.
So.
Brought the president into my home.
What time was he on?
Through the magic of television.
Eastern time?
9:01.
Okay. 9:01 Eastern time.
We looked at him for 30 seconds before they told him he could go.
Uh-oh. Whoops. Somebody messed up. The president says, quote, every day, Customs and Border Patrol agents encounter thousands of illegal immigrants trying to enter our country. We are out of space to hold them, and we have no way to promptly return them back to their home country. America proudly welcomes millions of lawful immigrants who enrich our society and contribute to our nation. But all Americans are hurt by uncontrolled illegal immigration. It strains public resources and drives down jobs and wages. Among those hardest hit are African Americans and Hispanic Americans. Our southern border is a pipeline for vast quantities of illegal drugs, including meth, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl. Every week, 300 of our citizens are killed by heroin alone, 90% of which floods across from our southern border. More Americans will die from drugs this year than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. Okay, so Lance, let's start with drugs. Okay. We're gonna talk a little bit here about some of what the president said. Now, let me just be clear, though. To the best of our ability to fact check this portion, technically, what the president said was not wrong in this section. Every week, 300 of our citizens are killed by heroin alone, 90% of which floods across from our southern border. Factually, that's true. However, the president left out something that is rather important if he's using this, which I believe he was, Lance. You correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I believe this was a case for the wall. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
We need a wall because of these problems.
Right.
A wall will fix these problems. As far as I know, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, Lance, but I don't think we've discussed building a wall along all of the southern border. We've talked about the land-based border between the United States and Mexico.
And the secret to this, as you're saying, trying to point out very nicely, is that the drugs come in through ports of entry from the south, meaning they come in from the water, typically stored in vehicles that are America bound.
Right.
So they are coming in from the south and landing in port cities and being unloaded, being stuffed in vehicles that then are driven across the United States to be sold. And that's where the drugs are being hidden. So they're not being carried in by people crossing the land from Mexico into the United States.
So a wall, in other words, that goes across the land that separates the United States and Mexico wouldn't stop boats that are carrying drugs. Oh, and if I'm understanding,
I'm shaking my head.
Okay.
No, since we're doing radio, no, it would not.
Okay.
At least my understanding of how boats operate and the use of them on land is typically not a good thing.
I'm really not trying to be facetious because it is serious, but at the same time, it's just like Lance and I, part of the reason you're going to sense this throughout this episode is for those of you who are longtime listeners and have caught every episode, then you know that we've already talked about this, what we're about to go over. But we have to go over it again to do a service to all of our listeners to make sure that new listeners, those who haven't heard it or those who forgot, have an opportunity to hear it again. So we're referencing an article about the Coast Guard, which was published in the New York Times, July 4th, 2017. Okay. So a little while ago, but nonetheless still very relevant. Admiral Majetti, who is part of the Coast Guard, says, when most people think border security, they think border patrol. What we do by intercepting drugs on the high seas has a direct connection to what happens at the southern border in terms of stopping illicit drugs and illegal connection. That's Admiral Majetti of the Coast Guard. There are newer ships like the Stratton, which is a Coast Guard cutter, but many others in the fleet are more than 50 years old. President Trump's new budget proposed to cut Coast Guard funding by 2.4%. Now, this next stat speaks directly to what we had referenced before, where he had mentioned that 90% of
the drugs coming into the United States,
of the drugs were coming through the southern border. Here we go. About 70% of cocaine that's consumed in the United States passes through a corridor that runs up to the borders of Guatemala and El Salvador. This is a sea corridor, Fighting among drug cartels that controls the smuggling routes has led to record high homicide rates in the area and driven thousands of people seeking asylum, which is where you get these caravans that we've been speaking about. So a little bit about the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard, they handle drug-related stuff? Well, yeah, the Coast Guard was founded more than 100 years ago, Lance, and it's part of the Department of Homeland Security. It operates simultaneously as a military service, a law enforcement agency, and as a member of the American intelligence community. So while technically managed by the Department of Homeland Security, in the event that we were engaged in war, it actually moves into the Department of Defense and is then controlled by the military. It's known primarily for its role in search and rescue missions. The Coast Guard, though, said its priorities are tackling drug trafficking organizations and protecting the southern border. So the Coast Guard said, not that its priority is search and rescues, that its priority is tackling drug trafficking and protecting the southern border. Funding the Coast Guard at current levels, which is nearly $10 billion, leaves the service struggling to combat the drug trafficking that has been pushed offshore by beefed up security on the southern border. So for those of you who are supportive of spending all this money on border security, it has had an effect, which means more people are coming by sea than were before.
And so since all of the drugs, since the majority of them now are coming by sea, we should not be cutting the Coast Guard's budget. And instead of spending it on the wall, maybe it would be better spent adding it to the budget of the Coast Guard so they could replace a couple of those 50-year-old ships and thereby stop even more contraband entering the southern ports of the United States.
I'm big on listening, when we talk about our armed forces.
Talking about solutions, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Kind of skipping there and jumping to the solutions. But it's like, okay, let's spend the money where it can be well spent. Let's spend the money where the problem is.
Admiral Paul Zumkraft, who is Commandant of the Coast Guard. And part of the reason I take just a minute, I always like to hear from the people out there doing this stuff or overseeing it, because they tend to know best what the situation is and what's actually going on. He says, so again, this is the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Paul Zumkoft, quote, "We give you the biggest bang for your buck. Just last year, we had intelligence on nearly 580 possible shipments, but couldn't go intercept any of them because we didn't have the ships or the planes to go after them."
Doesn't sound like we're allocating funds where we need to.
No.
We have evidence, we have clues, we have information that show almost 600 shipments of drugs into the United States that the Coast Guard could not respond to because they don't have enough ships and personnel. But we're worried, and rightfully so, about drugs coming into the United States. Sort of. I mean, I don't know. I'll keep holding my tongue.
Different debate.
Yes.
Possibly.
But if you're concerned about drugs coming into the United States, why do you want to build a steel, concrete, /wall, fence, pillars, whatever whatever you want, when the majority of the drugs are coming in from the water and the group that's in charge of stopping them on the water is underfunded?
Right.
I mean, if I'm going to pay my tax dollars to something, I want something that's going to actually work.
To understand, Lance, how effective they are, in 2016, the Coast Guard seized a record 450,000 pounds of cocaine, valued at nearly $6 billion, an amount that was more than all of the cocaine seized by land-based law enforcement agencies combined.
There you go.
So the Coast Guard...
There's your bang for the buck, right?
Yeah, he wasn't just blowing smoke, right? I mean, the Coast Guard seized 450,000 pounds of cocaine, which was valued at $6 billion. And that amount was more than all of the cocaine seized by all land-based law enforcement agencies. So that includes Border Patrol and organizations like the FBI, the DEA, so on and so forth. So all of those agencies seized less cocaine than the Coast Guard did.
And they have the smallest budget.
Yeah, and they have the smallest budget. Coast Guard boats also intercepted nearly 7,000 people trying to illegally enter the United States. Coast Guard officials say the intelligence gleaned from captured drug shipments and vessels has helped lead to the extradition of nearly 75% of all Colombian cartel leaders, and it contributed to the capture of a Honduran cartel leader and to the second capture of the Mexican drug lord better known as El Chapo. There's only so much you can say, Lance.
Sounds like
I think most of it speaks for itself.
Sounds like they're getting some, quote, bad people out of the country.
I think so. I mean, those sound like bad dudes to me.
Yep.
I don't know. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're nice. Maybe we leave them in. Coast Guard counterterrorism teams protect Mr. Trump during his frequent trips to Mar-a-Lago, the president's private club in Palm Beach. Boat teams protect both the Atlantic and intercoastal waterway sides of the property, while helicopters keep drones and other low flyers out of the airspace. The trips have added to the cost of the already overextended operations of the Coast Guard, and it has no additional funding for the protection of the president at his resort. So they have to go protect him every time he's there. Mm-hmm. So you could, I don't think this is too far of a stretch, right, Lance? I mean, they have no specific money to do that. So when he goes there, they have to spend money that would otherwise be spent on what their primary mission is.
Catching bad people,
which in their
bad
words,
stuff out of the country.
Is fighting illegal drug problems. I mean, those are their words. That's their primary focus. They have to divert attention from their primary focus to go protect the president where they have no funding to do so. And the president wants to give them less money.
Yep.
Okay. I'm just making sure. I'm really not trying to be unfair, everybody. No. I'm really not.
You understood exactly the way it was stated. Yes.
Okay. I'm just making sure that I'm relaying it in a concise way.
Just the facts, sir. Just facts.
Yep. Okay. Any final thoughts here, Lance, before we move on to the criminal immigrant? Because that's a big part of it.
Let's move on. Are we going to discuss the drug issue? Because I just have one comment about the drug issue.
Okay. Go ahead. I
mean, yes, we need to stop them from coming in. But just a rhetorical question out there, folks. Why don't we deal with the issues that cause people to take the drugs, because if the demand for drugs in the United States wasn't so high, they would not be coming here. Just a thought. Let's deal with the reason why people choose to take these drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And if we got rid of those problems, then drugs coming into the country would not be nearly the problem that they are. They only come here because people want to buy them. So let's deal with the reasons why people want to use these things. Then maybe we don't have as much of a drug issue. Just a thought. Please, the criminal element.
The criminal element. So we'll read you the part of Trump's speech. Again, we want to be fair. We're going to talk based off of the words that were said by the president last night. But before we do, Lance, why are we taking time to spell this out for people? What are we trying to accomplish?
We're hoping to accomplish through our mission statement that we want to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations here at True Chat. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to educate our audience and by talking about these things honestly, openly, and respectfully.
We're trying. Hopefully you're listening. And you know what? Seriously, if you're out there and you're having conversations with people, the way that you help with things like this is asking them to listen. And at the very least, at least relay this information. Then go find it. I mean, these articles, it doesn't matter who writes them because this information's available from the government. I mean, you can go get it yourself. You don't have to reference a particular news source to find it. And that includes us. You don't have to use us to relay this. It's available. So President Trump, in his speech, again, these are his words directly, quote, "Day after day, precious lives are cut short by those who have violated our borders. In California, an Air Force veteran was raped, murdered, and beaten to death with a hammer by an illegal alien with a long criminal history." He lists a few others here, but I'm going to skip ahead and I'll tell you why in a second. He says, "I've held hands of the weeping mothers and embraced the grief-stricken fathers. So sad, so terrible. I will never forget the pain in their eyes, the tremble in their voices, and the sadness gripping their souls. How much more American blood must we shed before Congress does its job?" So the reason I skipped a lot of that, Lance, is because basically we just give the president this. Everything he mentioned was true as far as those things having happened, those crimes that he mentioned and the way they happened. All of that's accurate. However, Lance, this is where we get to the problem, because is it fair to say that the purpose here is to communicate that immigrants who are illegally crossing the border are more violent than native-born Americans?
Well, that's what the president.
Is that what he's trying to?
That's his insinuation.
Insinuate here
by cherry picking those cases.
Okay,
that's what he's insinuating.
Just making sure. I'm not the only one who's thinking this. And if you think that that's not what he means, then you can let us know at TrueChat.org. We're on all the social media, so let us know, please. But here's the situation. Again, this is government data, so you can reference the FBI if you have questions. The immigrant population in the United States since 1980 to 2016, because that's the most recent year data available, okay, has seen a 118% increase in the immigrant population from 1980 to 2016. 118% increase. Violent crime rate since 1980 to 2016, minus 36%. Now, I've always pointed out, so I'll point out now, right, that correlation does not necessarily equal causation. One of the first things that anybody who's spent some time studying science at the higher education level was probably taught is that you can't automatically say that X equals Y just because A and B seem to make it look like they might, which is what we have here, right? I mean, what this tells me, Lance, is that the more the immigrant population goes up, the less violent America gets. But I can't just draw that because these are two separate data sets, and we don't know that for sure that's the case. But the reality is violent crime has gone down since 1980 by 36%. And immigrant populations have gone up by 118.
Has doubled, right.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's where we start.
It doesn't mean that some of these immigrants have not been committing violent crimes.
Yep.
But if they were all so bad, then why has the overall crime rate dropped?
Right. I mean, if you add, the thinking goes, I mean, to take this out, if we had more than doubled the population of immigrants and they're so violent, then why has the crime rate gone down? We'll build on a little bit though. Okay. As of 2017, according to Gallup polls, almost half of Americans agreed that immigrants make crime worse. Okay. Almost half. But is it true that immigration drives crime? Many studies have shown that it does not. In a large-scale collaboration by 4 universities, a sociologist at the State University of New York at Buffalo, researchers compared immigration rates with crime rates for 200 metropolitan areas over the last several decades. The selected areas included huge urban hubs like New York, as well as smaller manufacturing centers with that are less than 100th the size, like small towns in Indiana, and were dispersed geographically across the entire country. According to data from the study, a large majority of the areas have more immigrants today than they did in 1980, and they have fewer violent crimes. The Marshall Project extended the study's data up to 2016, showing that crime fell more often than it rose, even as immigrant populations grew almost across the board.
So people want to blame immigration for violent crimes, but the numbers don't show it.
The numbers don't seem to support that.
Right. Because it's easier to blame other people for my problems rather than to look inwardly. That's just human nature. I mean, that's just what people do, is blame others rather than look for the real reason. Because it's just easier to blame somebody else, particularly if I don't know them or they look or act differently than me, then it's easy to blame them.
Places with a sharp rise in the immigrant population experienced increases in crime rates no more frequently than those with modest or no growth in immigration. So in other words, places that saw an uptick in immigration, generally speaking, showed no correlation in the increase of crime, despite adding more immigrants. And those are in places specific to where immigration grew versus places where it did not.
Right.
In other words, they were identical in their uptick and downtick of crime, regardless of what was happening with immigration.
Can't let the facts get in the way of my opinion. Come on.
I guess not.
But again, that's what we're dealing with. That we want to make good decisions, but you can't make good decisions if you're not using the information that you have to make that decision. That's when you start to make bad decisions, is when you don't use the information that you have.
So all of this tells us, if I can sum it up, Lance.
So the Coast Guard, it would be better to spend our money to spend it on the Coast Guard than to do a wall, and to blame crime, increase in crime, which there's not an increase in crime. It's actually a decrease in crime.
Right.
On immigrants. You can't even do that because there hasn't been an increase in crime.
Right.
There's been okay, go ahead. You try, because I'm flabbergasted at this point.
It only took a couple seconds.
I can't blame the increase in crime on immigrants because, wait a minute, there hasn't been an increase in crime.
That's right.
There's been a decrease in crime in the last 35 years in the United States.
Yep. I don't know how much more there is to say than that. The reality, right? The facts from your government, from our government, who at the moment is led by President Trump, who many news outlets often refer to as his administration, right? Mm-hmm. Data from his administration tells us the immigrant population has more than doubled, while violent crime has dropped by at least a third.
Yeah.
And the majority of these illegal drugs that we care the most about come by sea, not by land. Mm-hmm. So we want to build a wall, which won't do anything to stop the ones by sea, except it will increase the amount of by sea drug trafficking that we have. Because guess what? When it's harder to come by land, they'll come by sea, which is already easier than coming by land. And we've established that the Coast Guard was more effective in 2016 than all of the other agencies who handle drugs combined, which includes our infamous Border Patrol.
What do you think Paul Revere would say about this?
I don't know. Go get the Coast Guard.
1 if by land, 2 if by sea, right?
I think it's just by sea. I think it's just, there's not a by land component.
Right.
We hang the two.
Because Paul was a smart guy. He would have just said by sea, by sea, by sea.
That's right.
And
they come by sea.
Yes, people, I know Paul Revere was made famous by a poem that was written 100 years after the whole thing, and he really wasn't the main one, and da-da-da. So anyway, I won't get into that, but just trying to.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, though.
Okay.
So President Trump's been talking about building a wall, right?
Yep.
So how much of a wall has he built here in his first
I have that data available.
2 years? Because, I mean, he's all about building the wall and looking at the wall and, all that kind of good stuff. And there is a wall in place, right? I mean, there
are 654 miles of existing barriers.
Okay.
So some of this includes like a true wall.
So we're not talking about starting from scratch.
No.
When the president talks about building a wall, previous administrations have built barriers along the southern land border.
A combination of steel slats, concrete walls, barbed wire fence, and chain link fence.
Okay.
So that's what currently makes up the 654 miles of existing barriers.
So the barriers / wall have been worked on.
Right.
In previous administrations.
Trump is proposing 1,000 miles of wall
to be added to the 600 and some that is already in existence.
Yes. And so far during Trump's presidency, 0 miles of new barriers have been added.
Even though the Republicans controlled Congress the first 2 years of his presidency.
That's correct. And this is up to date as of a couple days ago. So
why didn't they build
unless something happened in the last couple of days that I don't know about where they built a bunch of walls.
So why didn't they allocate and build a wall the first 2 years when they had it under control?
Well, my guess, Lance, is that because the way things in this country work are that Congress gets to decide how we spend money, that they decided, them being the Republicans, that it was a bad idea to spend money on a wall.
But Senator McConnell was quoted yesterday as saying, well, earlier this week, I shouldn't say that, it was in a news article yesterday, they said that Mr. McConnell reiterated he will not bring any legislation to the floor that the president does not approve of. But now you just told me that Congress is in charge of the spending bills.
They are.
So how is Mr. McConnell able to sit back and say, I will not bring any legislation to the floor that the president doesn't approve of? I didn't think the president was supposed to have control over what Congress voted on.
Ideally not, but good old McConnell has free will. So I guess he can just give the president power over his free will, I guess. You and I have that right too.
So there's already I
mean, I could say we're not going to broadcast tomorrow unless the president tells us it's okay.
Yeah. I guess.
We'd be waiting a while.
So there are bills that have been passed by the House that Senator McConnell will not let his delegation in the Senate have a voice on.
At least not yet. But the headlines this morning, Lance.
Because, according to Mr. McConnell, the president doesn't like them, so we're not going to vote on them.
That's right.
But that's not the president's job. That's not the Senate's job. The Senate's job would be to vote on those measures. And if they don't pass, then they have to go back to committee and try to find some common ground. But if lo and behold, it passed the Senate, just from your senior year in government class, Mr. Weller, what's supposed to happen at that point if the House passes legislation and the Senate passes the same language?
Then it goes to the president's desk and he may either veto or sign.
Oh, so Congress has the power to do that. And then the president can still say no if he wants.
They don't need his permission to send him anything.
Oh, okay. Gosh.
In fact,
do you think Mr. McConnell passed senior government class?
I don't have that data available.
What seems to be the stumbling block here? If the majority of
he hasn't released his 9th grade
of high school graduates in America understand that Congress's job is to pass bills and send them to the president to be either signed into law or vetoed. If the majority of high school graduates in the United States know that, how come Senator McConnell doesn't?
I also learned in American history. I had a pretty good teacher. He told us, or rather helped us discover on our own, that most of the founding fathers really feared a president that was very powerful, and they believed that if there was going to be a branch that should be the most powerful, it should be the legislative branch.
Yes.
That would be the branch that has the power. And the
because
other
we
two
were fearful of a king.
That's right.
/ tyrannical dictator / authoritarian.
And kings would basically tell lawmakers that they can't do something without his permission.
Right.
Wouldn't they?
Yes.
Okay.
So
now,
we went out of our way to establish a system where
to avoid that
wouldn't happen. Yes.
But to be fair to Trump, right, he hasn't told anybody that they can't do that.
That's true.
The Senate is just volunteering to not do anything that the president doesn't agree with.
Notice I didn't bring President Trump up in any of this.
That's right.
My whole condemnation was of Senator McConnell, that he is not doing his job as leader of the Senate to bring legislation to the floor for a vote.
It looks like it'll probably change soon, though, Lance, because the articles that were rolling in this morning was that some Republicans in the Senate are starting to get uneasy because they don't like the shutdown going on, and they're probably going to move to reopen the government.
But that shouldn't be the reason.
Right. No, it shouldn't.
The fact that it passed the House means that it should go for a vote to the Senate.
Yes.
And if the Senate, which is controlled by the Republicans, wants to vote it down, that more power to them.
I don't understand
not taking a vote. That's where I'm really struggling here as an American that we're not taking votes on things.
Yep.
Because we vote on everything. I mean,
we should be.
You know,
but we're not.
What are we ordering for lunch in the office today? You know, what are we? I mean, we take votes on everything, and all of a sudden, half of Congress is saying, "Yeah, we're not going to take a vote."
Yeah. Well, no, just one member.
One member.
Yeah.
Of Congress.
In fairness to the 99 senators who may actually want to vote.
I got you.
They just can't do anything about it.
Because the president doesn't like what we're going to vote on.
That's right.
Okay. Even though the president has the right to veto it.
Yep.
If it goes to their desk.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
Yep. Yeah, the ball is not in the president's court. It's in the Senate's, and the Senate both refuses to hear a vote on the legislation that's awaiting them, and they refuse to put forward their own legislation. So as far as I think everything's concerned, it's all balled up in the Senate right now. It's not the president's fault. It's not the House's fault. It's the Senate's fault, because they don't seem to be willing to do their job.
Okay.
At TrueChatRG on social media, let us know your thoughts. These facts are out there. Go look them up. The FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, oh my gosh, federal agencies overseen by the president. Go look up the data that is available, because it tells a pretty plain story. You can listen to True Chat Podcast everywhere that fine podcasts are found, including, Lance,
Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts.
Wow, nailed them today. For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change.